Next up, we have Indigenous rights, and we'll get started right away. So I will introduce Jordan Rusche from South Dakota State University, who is presenting on Indigenous representation in South Dakota education. Next to her is Gina Castro from Medill, FEMA Aid Disparities Delay Tribes Recovery in Louisiana. And Selena Aguilar Cecilio from Forsyth Tech Community College on the Rusche tribe restructuring to survive. I think you'll correct my pronunciation. Sorry. Fanny, Aahman from American University, the Guna people escaping Atlantis, and Brendan Ross from McGill, Portraits of Aboriginal Health in Taiwan. So thank you, all five. To Jordan.
Move this down because I'm short. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jordan Rusche. I am a senior English and journalism major from South Dakota State University, and I am here to talk about the Indigenous representation in South Dakota's education systems, and I am aware of the rhyming. All right, so kind of just a brief intro and overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I wanted to kind of just generally tell you about what my article is because I'm aware that not everyone really knows what the education systems look like in South Dakota. So I'm going to tell you first a little bit about the Oceti-Sakowee, which is the general name for the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota peoples in South Dakota. I'll tell you a bit for reasons for the limited cultural representation in the school systems, historically, politically, and socially, and then how this inclusion is being addressed mostly through cultural immersion schools and then support programs in the state for teachers. Okay, so first, just kind of a general map of the state and where our tribal reservations are. There are 9 recognized tribes in the state. The Cheyenne River Sioux, Crow Creek Sioux, Flandreau Santee Sioux, Lower Brill Sioux, Oglala Lakota, Rosebud Sioux, Sisseton Wahpeton Ayate, and Standing Rock Sioux, and then the Yankton/Ahunktuan Sioux. And so I mostly did my reporting out of the Rosebud Tribal Reservation, which is kind of down there in the bottom. And then Native Americans are the largest racial minority in the state. They make up 8.5% of our population. So the first kind of historical reason for why our state does not give a lot of representation to Indigenous history in the education systems is because of our history of boarding schools and residence schools. You can see there are 30 boarding and day schools in the state from 1873 to the 1970s. 10 of those are still around. They're not used as boarding schools, of course, anymore. They have reused the buildings either for public school buildings, for dormitories for students, as schools controlled by the Bureau of Indian Education, and one has actually been turned into a health clinic. The woman who's photographed here is Bev Warren. So she's an Oglala Lakota elder, and I talked to her for a couple different things in my reporting, one of them being that she did attend a boarding school when she was a child, once when she was 6 years old, and then again when she was 12 years old. And her experience, her mother also attended a boarding school as a child too. Her mother did tell of physical abuse in the school because they were instructed not to share their traditional culture, to cut their hair, to not speak their native languages. Bev said that by the time she was in the schools, it had switched more to verbal abuse. But this kind of generational trauma that they experienced led to a lot of Indigenous people in the state not knowing their culture, and therefore they didn't pass it on to their children, and many people in the state are not aware of the extent of this culture to this day. So one of the other problems is failed legislative and government efforts. So we have the Oceti-Sakowee Essential Understandings and Standards, which are concepts created by teachers and Indigenous folks in the state to educate teachers on how to incorporate their culture into their lessons. Now, there have been some legislative efforts to actually get this standardized in the social studies curriculums, but all those efforts have failed so far. And then there's also community schools, community-based schools that would be led by the tribes in the state so they can teach their children based on their values, and those efforts have failed as well. There have been bills introduced about the community schools ever since 2020, and every single one of those has failed. And the largest issue that I found, which actually kind of surprised me, was the biggest reason we don't have that much representation is because the teachers themselves are not confident teaching it. Most of the teachers in the state are white, because most of the population in South Dakota is white. And that's a quote there from the director of the Office of Indian Education, Fred Osborne, about that. So that survey kind of talks a little bit about how many teachers are actually teaching this and how many are feeling confident in themselves. This was a survey of 718 educators and administrators in our states. And of course, not all of them responded, so that's not a complete representation of educators. So then after looking all of that, I kind of wanted to ask, what is being done to actually address these problems? So immersion schools, Lakota immersion schools and cultural immersion schools are the largest proponent of increasing representation. One of the ones I talked to was the Wakanyija Tokiechi Lakota Immersion School, run by Sage Fast Dog in the Rosebud Reservation. That photo there is of one of their programs for their children. They teach about kindergarten through second grade. They have about 20 to 30 students, where they have to tell about something they're passionate about in Lakota. And some of them, in this case, the older students are able to write it. The younger students would have it printed for them. One of the other schools that I talked to, a parent of a student who went there, the Lakota Language Immersion Program in Canyon Lake Elementary in Rapid City on the west side of the state. Now, since this article has been written, unfortunately, that school has been postponed because they cannot find teachers, and there's some controversy on whether it's the teacher shortage or the school was not actually looking for teachers. However, there is a new school that's been started since the article, the Oceti Shakoi Community Academy for kindergartners in Rapid City as well. And then finally, one of the other main programs is just general teacher support programs. So like I said, many teachers are not confident teaching Indigenous history. And so we have the Wokie Project and NANAC, which is the Native American Nursing Education Center in Rapid City, which is part of my school, South Dakota State University. So the Wokie Project guides teachers on how to use the Oceti Shakoi understandings in their lessons. And there are several schools that are a part of that to kind of help, work with lessons and meetings to guide this integration. That photo is from one of their annual conferences. And then the cultural programs that NANAC offers, and Bev Warren is also a mentor for that program as well. She's been a nurse for about 60 years. Offers cultural programs, scholarships, and generally just gives more representation to the Native American nursing majors in that community. And so even though our state does have its fair share of issues giving fair representation to our Indigenous citizens about their history and their culture, which has historically been erased for a very long time, there are many, both Native and non-Native, Native and non-Native educators and administrators who are working to improve that. So, thank you. And that's a mural outside of Rosebud, near where Wakanyija Tokiechi is located, and that's some of the core principles of the Oceti Shakoi culture. So.
Hey y'all, I'm Gina, Castro, and I did my project on FEMA aid disparities, delayed tribes recovery in Louisiana. So I was down in the bayou of southern Louisiana. And I wanted to start with this photo because I think it really encompasses what this environment looks like. So you have this body of water, it's a bayou that runs right through these communities, and these homes are just right off the edge of it. Well, they were originally, acres away from the water, but as land loss increased, the water became closer to them. But also, these communities are completely supported by the fishing and shrimping industry. So you have all these boats always behind the homes, and they also use these boats to travel between the different communities as well. But also what's missing from this photo is a home that used to be right here. It was destroyed by Hurricane Ida in 2021, which took place during the pandemic. It was a Category 4 hurricane. And the woman who lived here is Chrysalyn Rodriguez. She lived with a family of 5, and she's also the deputy chief of the Duloc Band of Biloxi Chinchamacha. And her family applied a total of 8 times for FEMA aid and were denied each time. And so I reported on these total of 4 tribes that are in the Terrebonne Parish. It's the Grand Cayuse Dulac Band of Biloxi Chichimacha Choctaw Tribe, which is where Chrislyn Rodriguez is from, and the Alzadine Charles Band of Biloxi Chichimacha Choctaw, and the Ponal-Shin Indian Tribe, as well as the Houma Nation Tribe. And these tribes are state recognized by the state of Louisiana, not federally recognized. And it's important to make that distinction because their communication with federal organizations is heavily impacted by that. So to prove federal recognition or to get federally recognized, they have to go through this extensive process of showing that their government is similar to the US government, which of course is biased. And also, they have to show an extensive history of their tribes existing in Louisiana, which is also difficult when you take into consideration that they were colonized by the French, and then when US got further colonized. And then also, when you think of all the hurricanes that came, it becomes incredibly difficult to think of how can they document their presence here. But also, not being federally recognized impacts their ability to talk to federal government agencies like the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. So also, parishes in the state of Louisiana are the same as counties. So Terrebonne Parish, to give you an idea of where these tribes are located, if you see all of this red right here, that is the Google Maps desperately trying to document land loss. It's constantly changing the land here. And Terrebonne Parish was actually once the largest parish in Louisiana, but a lot of land is now underneath the water. And the tribes I was mentioning, the Dulac Band of Biloxi Chichimacha Choctaw Tribe is located here in Dulac, and there's so much water around it. And then just right over here, Chauvin and Montague is where Ponal-Shin tribe is located, and some Houma Nation people. And then right over here is the Alzadine Charles tribe. So they're surrounded by so much water, and to commute to the main city, the biggest city nearby, Houma, is about an hour for both of these, or for all of these tribes. And then to commute from Dulac to Chauvin is about 40 minutes, and then Chauvin, Montague, and the Alzadine Charles is about like 20, 30 minutes. So when I was driving around there, it was exhausting to be going from here to there. But also a lot of them commute by water to make it a little faster. So when you think about like a major hurricane hitting these areas, and there's lack of gas access because you have to wait for all the transportation during a major storm like that, and then also flooding is there and debris is blocking the roads, it becomes really difficult to travel to the main city, Houma, which is where the first disaster recovery centers are set up, like the nearest disaster recovery centers from FEMA are set. So, yeah. And Louisiana has the most land loss in the country, and that's 0.3%. And then when you actually look at the tribal lands that I was just showing you in Terrebonne Parish, they're more than twice that amount of land loss. And that is mostly caused by the oil industry and climate change. So the oil industry has pipelines, and its dredging destroys the wetlands that are the natural defense against major storms, like hurricanes and Hurricane Ida, which my project was primarily focused on. And so as climate change makes these hurricanes more intense over time, these communities are incredibly impacted by these storms. And just like Janie Luster, her home here, like half of it was washed away and washed into the bayou behind her home, where she had a houseboat. That was her second option, living space, in case Hurricane Ida destroyed her home. But the destruction from her home destroyed the houseboat. And FEMA doesn't really fill in those gaps either, because it's so incredibly difficult to be able to prove those damages and get the assistance from them among these tribes. And so when my multiple trips to Louisiana and the Terrebonne Parish, I was just constantly hearing these harrowing stories about people's experiences, trying to talk to FEMA, the months it takes for FEMA to even get to them, and just how also mind-boggling it is to be in the middle of a crisis, within a crisis, like Hurricane Ida was during a pandemic, and be able to take all this time to show FEMA that, all the damage that happened. So I sent in this monster of a FOIA request to FEMA for trying to get an idea of how much funding FEMA gives for housing, for renters, for FEMA trailers, for disaster recovery centers, the number of disaster recovery centers, the number of disaster assistance teams that are deployed out there. just to get an idea of how to support their stories with data. And there's 1,000,001 stories in that FOIA request, but the one I decided to focus on was how FEMA's resources that are supposed to help isolated communities like those on the Terrebonne Parish, how effective they were. And it turns out they only helped 2% of the residents in Terrebonne Parish, and that is the largest percentage they helped out of all the coastal parishes in Louisiana. And then I just wanted to leave you all with some quotes from people who were displaced from their ancestral homeland and the impact it has on their culture and how important it is to preserve Indigenous culture in Louisiana. And also like people like Chief Sherrill, who do extensive fundraising and don't have access to FEMA, but make these connections outside the state with nonprofits and other people who care about the area and fill in the gaps of the federal government. And thanks, Pulitzer Center.
All right. My name is Selena Cecilio, and I will be covering the Purepecha tribe. So this tribe is actually located on the west coast of Mexico, and that's a little bit more of my time there. So the tribe is actually going through a lot of restructuring, and when I say Purepecha, I want you to also think about like Aztecs and kind of that time frame, because they actually did go to war with Aztecs. So they have been going through a lot of restructuring as is over this time period, but I want to really focus on the challenges that they're facing currently. So Purepecha is in the state of Michoacan, which they are kind of dispersed all over of Michoacan, but I want to focus on Santiago Sajo, which is a small village. In this village, there are about a little over 1,800 full-time citizens. So most of the actual citizens that used to live there have migrated to the U.S. around California, North Carolina, and so on. So some of the issues that they're facing right now are around political issues and as far as like how they want to structure their government. They had a tribe council, just like any other indigenous group, that they had appointed for 3 years, and unfortunately, last year in July, they went around collecting signatures, pretty much telling the people that this was to accept a federal budget for the town council. So everyone agreed and signed on, obviously wanting to accept this budget. This budget was supposed to go towards infrastructure. It was supposed to go towards water pipelines, things of that nature. Unfortunately, what this actually meant and what the signatures actually meant was they were signing on saying that they wanted to become self-governing and autonomous. So the town actually didn't know about this until the state of Michoacan released the order in August, and it was actually publicized in December. So a lot of corruption happened during this time. So there's been a lot of restructuring happening. Unfortunately, what this did was really take away the already limited resources that they had, like garbage disposal. They don't really have a system now where, what do they do with all their garbage? They're trying to figure out, should they start their own landfills, or should we reach out to municipalities? Like, what do we do? They're pretty much starting from scratch. Another thing is on the bottom left, there was a main water pipeline that broke, and they had no one to actually come out and help them, so they had to go door to door looking for volunteers to go out and fix it themselves. So some of the issues that are going on right now is that, and also security. They don't have any police or law enforcement there, so there's a lot of crime happening right now because they can pretty much get away with it. And because of this, a lot of protests started happening in January of this year in light of everything that they found out. The protest, I was shocked during my findings. I thought it was a protest against the self-governing part. In reality, it was more of the fact that they just felt like they were lied and cheated. They were okay with being self-governing, but they really didn't like how they got to that point. And also just wanting a clean slate with the new tribal council, but how do you restart? Like, how do you go about that? I thought that was very interesting in my findings. So on the other side of this, due to the deceitfulness that happened here, the actual tribe itself has been asking for more transparency. So they have requested the actual municipal of Quesnel, which is pretty much like your capital, to come in and inform voters, inform citizens of what actually it means to be self-governing. What are your options? What are the resources that are available, and how to pretty much get the town up and going again. So I think that was a very beautiful thing that they came in and started hosting town hall meetings literally at their local basketball courtyard. And I also wanted to highlight that while this was happening in Mexico, there's so many citizens in North Carolina that they were also having almost like Zoom-like town hall meetings here while this was also going on in Mexico. So it was very beautiful. Like, you know, it was across borders that this was kind of affecting everyone. And that was just a picture of a lady that was checking in. The literacy rate there is something that I also kind of faced as far as it was really hard to help them understand what was really happening, just because, I mean, like key terms, you know, government, political stuff like that, it was very hard for me to connect with them, I guess. So I thought it was beautiful that older generations were also being involved in this. So currently, what's happening there in light of all of this, the municipality is engaging in Santiago Sajo and allowing them to kind of decide how they want to structure themselves, allow them to appoint a new tribal council, which was what happened on September 23rd recently. And I think it's very interesting because what I've realized is we have so many citizens in the US that a lot of American politics has now influenced how they want to structure this village. So I am hopeful for them, and I'm excited to see what they will do with this opportunity. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Fanny. I made this awesome little documentary film about the Guna people. I just want to start off by saying, wow, I am so impressed by y'all. I had no idea how tough foreign correspondence was before I went to Panama and had to survive on fish and rice for 2 weeks in a 100-degree weather while remembering to email Libby that I was still alive, which is tough because we had no internet. But it was fun, and I got this awesome film out of it. Anyways, I want to take this opportunity to introduce you to this woman. This is Matilde Tejada. She is a resident of Gardi Subdub, which is a tiny little island outside of the San Blas archipelago in Panama. And she considered this her own personal Atlantis. Here, her community fish, they harvest yuccas, and they live in close-knit communities. They even gained independence for their own little Atlantis in 1925, so they worked hard for it. But now they're facing two major problems. This is their little Atlantis, by the way. Overpopulation, and climate change is sinking their islands to the very bottom of the Caribbean. But luckily for Matilde, her community are a bit of pioneers. So I'm going to introduce you to one of them. This is Sila Davis. He comes from a long line of Guna chiefs. And he's among the first ones to initiate a move to the mainland, to La Barriada, which is a place on the mainland within the Guna semi-autonomous region. And they've been trying to build a infrastructure here for 12 years for mass resettlement. And within the next 3 years, they're hoping to move here. But only the younger generation, the elders, they're gonna stay back. So when I first met Sila Davis, I was like, who is this old man wanting some peace and quiet on this island that's just gonna send away the younger generation? But his reasoning behind this took me by surprise. You see, Sila Davis, he's not just anyone. He is a vessel of the Guna gods. He communicates with Baba and Nana, which is the Guna gods that they believe in. And this time the Guna gods are telling him, hey, it's time to move back to the mainland. Because he explained this to me. 200 years ago, the Gunas actually lived on the mainland. But after a conflict with the Spanish in Colombia, the Guna chiefs back then had this dream about the San Blas archipelago, the 365 magic paradise islands. So they moved, and now the same things happen again. They're having these dreams, and they want to move back. That's his point of view. That's his reasoning. So his community is buying into this, but they're having questions. They're asking, what about our cultural identity? Is that going to disappear once we move to La Barriada? What about the elders? Who's going to pass down this culture? And are we even going to be happier there? All they know for sure is that time is ticking, water is on their doorstep, and all eyes are on the Gardi Sugdub community to see how successful their move to the mainland will be, to see if the others will follow. So what are the journalistic takeaways we can take from this story? Well, for me, it was that we cannot tell climate change stories without Indigenous voices, the very people that link their identity to the climate around them. For example, Matilda and Sila Davis, they make sense of who they are in this world through the environment, through their spiritual sense in this world. So when we go down to interview people at our local store, our campuses, these people in general don't tend to understand or even experience the environment in the same way as these people do. So, because you see, in our world, we have carved a space for ourselves in this environment. These people have entangled themselves with this. So when these entanglements are uprooted, we can't even begin to fathom how they experience it. So, but we can listen, we can adapt, and we can normalize giving them a platform. So frankly, in my mind, without interviewing Indigenous people in climate change reporting is simply incomplete, because they offer this different perspective. For example, when I interviewed the Guna people, I quickly came to realize they don't even have a word for climate change. They don't talk about it. They don't even have the vocabulary for it. So they don't talk about carbon monoxide levels or climate change-induced hurricanes, but that doesn't make them any less important to the conversation. So I think we have so much to learn about their way of living sustainable with the environment and the land for centuries, and we just need to tap into this deep well of cultural knowledge and redefine who is an expert on climate change, because it might not be the scientists that we so love to interview. But yeah, that was it. Thank you so much to Pulitzer Center for this great opportunity, and Professor Bill Gentile for always supporting me. Thank you, guys.
Hello, good morning. My name is Brendan. I'm a medical student at McGill in Canada. I feel like we're nearing the 7th inning stretch of this morning. So I just want to give everyone a chance. You don't have to, but just roll your shoulders or do a full neck roll, or this will be relevant to my presentation later. I would like you to just massage your temples and really get the blood flowing to your head so no one passes out. Okay. So the title of my project is Portraits of Indigenous Health in Taiwan. Before I begin, I thought it might be helpful to share a little bit about how I came to my project. At the beginning of medical school, I started working with physicians in Taiwan. I hoped to learn how Taiwan had reformed their healthcare system in the 1990s and became a model for socialized medicine all over Asia and truly all over the world. Soon I learned, though, that in Taiwan there are certain groups with poorer health outcomes. And similar to in Canada, where I study, the groups with the poorest health outcomes are Indigenous people. And in the process of doing various research projects there, however, another story came to light, not just the poorer health outcomes, but in speaking to local people, I learned how Indigenous health practitioners were blurring the lines between Indigenous health and Indigenous medicine and Western medicine, and creating their own special interventions, particularly in mental health. So I'm excited. I'm still waiting to conduct my Pulitzer reporting trip this February, But today I'm excited to share some Indigenous health stories coming from Taiwan and some of the conversations I've had virtually and using some photos from a previous trip. Okay. So to start, it might be helpful to situate everyone a little closer to the Indigenous communities in Taiwan. There are about 600,000 Indigenous people in Taiwan, or about 3% of the population, which is actually similar to the 3% of the population in Canada. I also think these two maps are very helpful because Taiwan is a very mountainous country. And the development of Indigenous groups, you can see there's around 16 groups that developed all over Taiwan, and they all have their own distinct languages and cultures. Taiwan is also, for the record, the size of Maryland, with mountains as high as 13,000 feet. So people maybe 30 miles away speak completely different languages, which I find amazing. All right, this is a picture of some of the mountains looking down toward the coast. And I focused my research in this area called the Huadong Valley, which is actually at the very edge of the Eurasian plate, tectonic plate, which I think is interesting. Last month there was a massive earthquake there that may be read about in the news. And in this valley, there's several Indigenous groups. I focused on two. One, the Bunong, who live up in the central mountain range. They're shorter and hunters. And then the coastal Indigenous group is the Aahman. They're matriarchal, so the bosses are the old grandmas, and they're fishers and farmers. And this is another look at the plain in a different season. So there's constantly rice coming out of the ground and then being harvested. I also think it's helpful to situate the Taiwanese Indigenous more broadly in the context of the Pacific. So there's actually been a lot of research into the languages of the Austronesian people that stretch all the way from Taiwan to New Zealand. And a lot of studies have shown that they think that people first traveled from Taiwan in boats to the Philippines, and then to Indonesia, or what is now Indonesia, all the way to New Zealand. So there's some linguistic similarities between Maori language and languages in Taiwan, which I did not know about before I started talking to these groups. So I think to get back to why I'm talking about Indigenous in Taiwan, I think why does this matter? I talked to several local Indigenous people, and they mentioned that the reason for poor health outcomes is twofold for them. One, they have a lack of access to proper health care, and the other is lack of access to culturally safe care. If anyone knows of picture, I didn't show a picture of Taipei, but Taipei is a mega city, only a few hours away from this village up in the mountains, which looks like a health station that's not open. And you can see here on this board, the times for the clinic are only open 3 days of the week for a few hours as health teams come up to the mountains. So for the rest of my presentation, I know we have a few minutes, but I wanted to introduce 3 profiles of interesting people I met who I think are subverting narratives of these poor health outcomes of Indigenous. One is this guy, Kulas Umo. His family are rice harvesters. So they lease out this high-tech rice harvesting equipment. But he grew up Indigenous with traditional Indigenous practices. And in college, he had this experience where he went out into the forest and felt like he had this connection with some of the local spirits and decided to become a shigawasai, or a shaman in Aahman culture. He then also, though, as he was working with people in his community and sometimes they would come to him with personal crises or health crises, and he decided he wanted more of a framework to speak to non-Indigenous medical colleagues. So he's also getting a master's degree in medical anthropology in Hualien, which I find fascinating because he's finding a way to integrate both Indigenous learning with some medical anthropology. The second person who I will briefly show is E.B. Jiang. He's a wood carving artist and he's Bunong. And he's also a massage therapist or Indigenous health practitioner. So in his family, several people had some severe pain issues, and so he learned how to integrate Chinese medicine, Tui Na, and with Indigenous ideas around health. And he was teaching me some temple rubbing techniques that are apparently a little better than the ones I knew before. And he also spoke to me about how he finds carving both wood and then also working with the body as a way to ground to what is really truly important about human beings. And he his practice includes making a little wooden owl every single day. The final person I'd like to profile is Pansai Arai. These are her 3 children. She was a nurse at an elderly care center in Taiwan, but she got frustrated because all these elderly Aahman patients weren't able to communicate very well with other doctors in the hospital or even speak to their own grandchildren. So she quit being a nurse and decided to start a field school for her children and other local Aahman children. And this is them learning some techniques how to grow indigenous grains, actually from a Bunong agricultural expert. So I guess in conclusion, as I'm running out of time, I think that this is the coffee shop where I happen to have met a couple of these people. And I think when we think about Indigenous health, sorry, I'm actually going to go to my notes for this. So I realize these are just brief vignettes, but I think these profiles are important because they show how the future of Indigenous health in Taiwan is being directed by Aahman and Bunong leaders. I also think mental health is a societal issue as much as a biological one. And I think these stories show how a few individuals are using deep stewardship in their community to promote real healing. I also found it noteworthy that like these forms of Indigenous practice are very flexible in terms of how they can work to make us whole. And I think they're just as advanced as the most advanced clinical trial or new biotechnology. And so I think these people, Panchayat, EB, and Kulas, are enthusiastic about calling up traditional forms of Indigenous knowledge in their work, but I also believe what they're doing is profoundly radical and relevant to all of us in thinking about our collective future. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it for questions.
Those were excellent presentations and all fascinating subjects. I think there are a couple takeaways from a few of you that actually apply to all of you. We need a seat at the table is one. Another, we cannot tell climate change stories without Indigenous voices. And we need to redefine who is a climate expert. I think all of you spoke to those issues. So next step, do you have questions for each other? Jordan?
Yeah, I kind of have a dual question for Gina and Fanny because I feel like both your articles kind of have very similar like ideas behind them, and two semi-autonomous Indigenous tribes kind of dealing with impacts of harsh weather or climate change. So for Gina, I have a question of if the tribes that you talked about in Louisiana are receiving any like state funding or state help as opposed to federal, or if there's any like local help that they are able to get. And then for Fanny, if the Indigenous tribes near Panama get any, get any help from kind of their local government, or if they're sort of on their own for kind of, you know, restructuring sort of.
Yeah, for the state funding question, I'm not aware of them getting state aid from Louisiana. I am aware of them doing like crowd fundraising and really just making their own kind of campaigns and building websites and making their own kind of videos as well to draw public attention.
Sure, it's on. Okay. Yeah, they are getting help with the resettlement project. It's kind of been slowed down due to like some contractual issues. I think it's because of COVID, but they are getting help, but it's just moving very slowly.
Oh wait, actually I just remembered, that just reminded me of the resettlement project for the Isles de Jean Charles. There's a lot of controversy with it. It was supposed to be initially a resettlement action from the state of Louisiana to move, because they're like really the most heavily impacted by the rising waters, but it's quickly become like a gentrification project. It was supposed to be something that they were supposed to set homes aside for this tribe, but instead now everyone can buy in for this land.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so I want everybody here to keep rubbing their temples in order to think of more questions. Michael, why don't
This question is for Mr. Ross. I found it really interesting that you talked about shamanic healing practices and indigenous healing practices being as effective as modern medicine in a lot of ways, and that's encouraging for me. A lot of people who are from indigenous communities anecdotally understand that these things are effective, but I don't think it's been peer-reviewed, and I know in the medical community it's considered quackery. In your findings and your research, as you talk to your colleagues in medical school, how is it received?
That's a great question. I think that one way to answer that question is to talk about addiction very briefly. So in these communities, they have higher rates of alcohol addiction than the normal population and the rest of the population in Taiwan. And doctors often say, look at that as a structural issue. But if you talk to indigenous shaman healers, they mention how there's a religious component of drinking rice wine in those communities. And they think of drinking alcohol as a way of connecting to the gods and to the spirits in the earth. And for those people, basically alcohol was reintroduced in mass consumption form in the last 20, 30, 40 years, whereas before rice wine was very, very precious. So you could maybe have a few sips a few times a month. So it's not really their fault, of course, at all, that now that alcohol is a commodity. And second, I think that when you're talking about substance abuse programs, to think about abstinence for them is maybe not the best thing if you're cutting off their connection from their spiritual ancestors and their roots to the earth. So I think when you talk to even addiction medicine physicians in Taiwan, they're open to working with these indigenous practitioners and thinking about how can we recreate a substance abuse program for someone if maybe there has to be a different healthy way where they can relate to this substance that doesn't completely shut it out. I think that those conversations are ongoing, and the question about peer review is very challenging. I think that our biomedical paradigm is set up to sort of put an A or a B and to look for those, and oftentimes the data is a little more murky when you get into cultural questions and questions like this. So, but a great question.
We have a question over here.
Hi, such great project. I had a question. What's the thought process like, especially when you're reporting from communities you're not from? How was that for, when you think about duty of care? Anyone can answer.
Was that directed towards anyone?
I think the question, I think I have the gist of the question is that basically the question is not being from Taiwan, A, not being indigenous, B, being a white man, C, and for all of us not from these communities, how do you engage with them in a way that's respectful and caring and I think gives proper consideration for everything happening? I think that in Taiwan I found that as long as you go in, a lot of these people I met volunteering with them. So I think I didn't go in immediately rolling the tape and saying, hey, tell me your story. The Aahman mother I met, I started volunteering with their organization. And I just said, I can help teach English a few times a week. And I did that for a few weeks, and I think I just got to know them. And so I think if you get to know people before you maybe jump to trying to extract a story, I think that can be helpful. But I think also just remaining conscious of the fact that you have to have humility. I'll let other people speak because I think everyone has their own way to discuss this, but I think you have to be humble and know that they're the experts of their home. So coming with that humility is important.
Yeah, I mean, it has to happen on their terms. So when I went to their islands, I just kind of put the camera away and everything, just walked around, met people, kind of see their way of life, and it's very chill on the islands, to just kind of roll with the waves. So I woke up early morning, talked to people as best as I could, and I had a great guide to help me translate and everything. And whenever I was unsure, because it was really tough for me to understand their spiritual way of viewing things, because that's not something I'm used to. So I just really took time with that. And I feel a great way is bouncing back the question. So if they tell me something, I'm oh, great. Wait, do you care to explain that again? Or am I understanding this right if I'm putting it like this? And then you can kind of confirm your understanding, so you can portray them in the right way, if that makes sense. No, you guys.
Yeah, I can just say I put a lot of quality time into building trust with them. So I didn't just immediately knock on people's door and start interviewing them. I definitely did a couple trips getting to know people and just meeting them where they're at, and spending some quality time, not even just interviewing them, especially about people losing their homes. That's really traumatic, and there were so many interviews where people were feeling, brought to tears to talk to me about it, and just being really sensitive and careful about when I ask those complex questions.
And yeah, for me, since it's in my home state, a lot of these people, I introduce myself as I'm from the area, so there was kind of that understanding that I was not like an outside person coming in and trying to question them about all these different things. And I also, most of the time, I just let them guide the conversation because, and it's something that I've always tried to do in my reporting is I never like going to a place, especially in traditionally, historically underrepresented groups, going in and grilling them and then leaving right away. All I need them for is just, to check, a box on my list. So I would tell them what was going on. I would tell them what I was interested in knowing. I would ask a few kind of guiding questions, but for the most part, I just let them tell their story. I also worked pretty closely with people who knew these people a little better than I did. For example, a woman named Erica Moore used to work at SDSU in the American Indian Student Center. I had talked to her for some articles before, and she was a lot more heavily ingrained in the tribal communities than I was, so I asked her if she knew anyone who would be, a good source, as opposed to kind of just going out and finding someone who I knew wouldn't be interested in talking or would not, I'm trying to think of the right word. She was able to find people who would be good sources for me in terms of their experiences, but who also would best understand what I was doing so I wouldn't be infringing upon anyone's privacy, essentially, who wasn't already open to sharing their experiences.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you guys for sharing. My question is for Jordan. I cover the Missouri legislature, and education is incredibly politicized right now. I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. I'm wondering, how did the South Dakota legislature and lawmakers at any level either support these efforts to better teach Indigenous history or impede them?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. So that kind of depends on which level of government. For example, Fred Osborne, the director of the Office of Indian Education, was very pro, creating these programs and getting more representation and teaching teachers how to do an effective job of actually, educating their students in a respectful and truthful way. And the further kind of up you get in the government, for example, from, the governor's perspective and more senators and representatives, I don't think there's anyone specifically saying you cannot teach these values. No one would openly say that, whether they believe it or not. But it's more just lack of support through omission, I think would be a good way to describe it. Because no one is telling these tribes that they can't create, that they can't teach their students through these values. It's just they're also not offering any support. For example, the community-based school legislation that has been trying to get passed, they argue it's because it would technically count as a charter school, and it kind of depends on how you look at it and whether that would be true or not. But it's a lot of, we're not telling you no, but you have to figure it out yourself. And that is the problem that a lot of tribes are facing, because a lot of them just do not have the resources to do that by themselves. So they need support from the government or their local communities. And that's where a lot of those issues are coming from. So, thank you.
Thank you. All right, we have time for one more question.
Wonderful presentations. My question is open, anyone can answer it. So I'm just curious, what do you guys think is the biggest threat to these communities? Is it assimilation into a society where they feel like their culture would be destroyed? Is that the biggest threat? Or do you feel like there are other threats to these communities that the general public might not know about?
I guess I can go again. And so I'm probably not going to give a super satisfying answer, and that's mostly just because as a white person who did not grow up near many of these reservations, there are a lot of intricacies that I just do not know because of my background. But just based on my reporting, a lot of it is just kind of like what I said, a lack of government support. And even outside of education, our state has a huge problem in making sure that Native Americans have access to voting options. There's only, especially in reservations, there can be one voting poll 200 miles from where you live, and if you don't have access to a car or transportation, because we don't have a lot of public transit systems, especially in that side of the state, you can't vote. And so your voice is not heard. There's also a lot of mistrust in sending in absentee ballots if they, will get in on time. So it's mostly just a lack of system support and government support for our tribes in hearing them and getting them the support that they say they need. Because there are a lot of issues systemically that, colonization and pushing people to kind of the boundaries of our state, pushing them off of their native lands, that has led to all of these systemic issues that our government could, at least has the means to fix, but they're not really listening. And so these issues aren't getting fixed. And like I said, the tribes don't always have the necessary resources to do it themselves.
I would say erasure is definitely a major issue facing the tribes on the Louisiana coast. When I was just traveling around Homa and all those different bayou communities, just talking to locals, so many locals had no idea tribes even existed in Louisiana. And even just the people I spoke with and their schools that they were going to weren't being told about Indigenous people. And as these tribes are literally, like their tribal land is literally going underwater, and more of them are being displaced further and further up in Louisiana or across the South, it's definitely, it's just a general threat of their erasure of their culture, language, and people.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just want to say I am so impressed with the depth of your all's knowledge and the research that went into these projects. So thank you, and thank you for the great question.